Forsaken, originally written in 2006, Amoran Kai stood in the doorway, staring out across the fields at the approaching dawn that was beginning to inch its way across the horizon with the rising of the sun. The sun's rays being a barely perceptible pearl light on the edge of the horizon. Dawn was only a couple of hours away, and it wouldn't be too long before the guards came to rouse them from their beds and herd them into the mess hall, before marching them out into the fields for the day's work. He swept his gaze over the 5 sleeping men in the shack they shared and scoffed, his thin purple lips twisting into a sneer. Amoran turned his attention back to the world outside and continued to watch the advancing sunlight. He should be sleeping like the rest of them, but he hadn't been able to sleep much since he'd arrived here. His rage and thirst for revenge kept him awake at night. He had been too consumed by anger and hatred at the injustice done to him to sleep. He had been betrayed and cursed at the hands of the vile and treacherous Quanren Far, the Inquisitor who was responsible for him being here. The one who was responsible for ruining his life, reputation, and promising career. It was Quanren Far and his treachery that had engineered Amoran's downfall, which had seen him cast out of the ranks of the warrior caste and regulated to that of the Forsaken. All because he desired Amoran's woman, Vicky Shan, and wanted to be free to pursue her, away from the vigilant gaze of the warrior who would beat him to death if he so much as touched her. Vicky Shan was of the warrior caste, and it was forbidden for members of different castes to breed or enter into relationships with each other, but Quanren Far cared little for the sacred rules of their hierarchical society. He saw Vicky's beauty and wanted her for his own, and because of his role as assistant to the Grand Inquisitor, Amoran was powerless to do anything about him harassing his woman, sans actually molesting or raping her. Amoran was an obstacle to Far's goal of getting his hands on her, so he concocted a fiendish plot to rid himself of his rival once and for all. Amoran was a member of Domain Kai, and like many of his brethren, a devout servant of the gods and dedicated warrior. Like all warriors, he had undertaken numerous rituals and medical procedures to augment his body with biological implants and modifications as a display of his prowess as a warrior, and to signify his devotion to the gods. Their people, the Len Dai, were experts at biologically engineering technology. It had formed the basis for their technological advancements for millennia. Crossbreeding, advanced surgical procedures, genetic experimentation, and design from their biologists and bioengineers had led to their technology becoming biology-based. It was all thanks to the work of their inquisitors, who were the physicians, scientists, engineers, and academics of Len Dai society, the inquisitors being one of the 5 caste systems. The other 4 were the warriors, priests, serfs, and the Forsaken. The priests were the smallest yet most significant caste, taking care of all spiritual and political matters in their theocratic society. The inquisitors followed behind them, being significantly more numerous, yet relatively small in number, followed by the warriors and then the serfs, the 2 largest castes numerically. Together they made up 70% of the population. The rest were those who had been abandoned, shamed, rejected, and cursed by the gods, destined to spend the remainder of their days on the fringes of society, wallowing in poverty, and often being used as slave labor. They were the Forsaken, the ones who had displeased the gods and had fallen from their good graces. Cowards, heathens, the disabled and deformed, they were the rejects of Len Dai who had fallen to the lowest rung of society from which there was no return. Amoran growled low in his throat when he thought of how he had come to find himself among them. He had been a highly respected and decorated warrior, the veteran of numerous bloody campaigns where he had served with honor and brought pride and prestige to himself and his clan. Like all great Len Dai warriors, he had received numerous implants and modifications to his body that served as both weapons and symbols of his prowess in battle. Among the numerous alterations his body had endured, the most significant was his left eye, which had been replaced with a mungden, which was a bulbous-like creature genetically modified and designed to allow the host to see in the dark and possess the ability to squirt a paralyzing venom that sent the target's nervous system into a state of paralysis. Amoran was scheduled for a procedure to have a sarok implanted onto his left arm, replacing his hand with the 4-taloned claw-like appendage that functioned as a lethal and effective stabbing and slashing weapon that could launch the claws like darts before rapidly growing new ones. The fiendish Quanran Far had learnt of the operation and purposefully poisoned the medicines that were to be used in the procedure. The operation was successful, but soon after the tainted chemicals began to take effect and the implant began to fester. Infection set in as pustules formed on the claw's flesh and spread up Amoran's arm. Despite the physician's best efforts, the Sarro claw implant was rejected by the warrior's body and began to die, becoming a limp, lifeless husk. He had amputated the lifeless limb himself soon after, completing the process with a purification ritual to hopefully appease the gods. Throughout the whole ordeal he could feel his brethren watching and judging him. None dared to address him, being either too embarrassed, cowardly, or repulsed to directly challenge him on the matter. Whenever he had managed to catch them staring at him, they averted their gaze, but he could feel their eyes on him, and hear their whispered chatter as they gossiped about what had befallen one of the greatest warriors of the Lendai. What had he done to earn the gods' scorn? Why had they abandoned him, such a brave and loyal soldier, who represented everything a Lendai warrior should be? Surely he was guilty of some great crime or dishonor he had managed to keep secret, but nothing was beyond the attention of the gods. They knew all and saw all. Amoran was hurt and confused by the shocking turn of events. Why had the gods deemed him unworthy of their grace? He had done much more than most and had walked a righteous path. So why did they turn their backs on him and mark him as one of the Forsaken? His love, Vicky Shan, rejected him, refusing to stand by his side, lest her loyalty to one of the Forsaken also mark her to be cursed. When the physicians admitted there was nothing they could do, and the limb died, his fate was sealed. Guards came to arrest him, and Amoran, too dispirited and heartbroken, surrendered to them without complaint, lost and confused as to why the gods had chosen to reject him. He was imprisoned while awaiting shipment off-world to a work colony somewhere in the expansive Lendai Empire, where he was to spend the remainder of his days working in a forced labor camp. It was then that the despicable Quanran Far came to mock him, foolishly revealing that it was he who had caused his Sarra claw transplant to reject, so he could be free to pursue Vicky Shan for his own sick pleasure, without the threat of Amoran Kai to prevent him from doing so. Amoran's depression and shame at being rejected by the gods turned into rage as he realized he had been used, manipulated, and betrayed by the treacherous Inquisitor. He grit his teeth and clenched his fists as he thought of it. Quanran Far had made the fatal mistake of revealing his treachery to him. The revelation had turned him from a broken, hopeless man who had given up on life into a seething cauldron of rage and fury, hell-bent on revenge against the Inquisitor who had taken everything from him. Redemption meant nothing to him. His honor and standing in Lendai society mattered little. No one would believe his story regardless, and none would listen or come to his aid. All he cared for now was revenge. If it was the last thing he did, he would throttle the life from his nemesis and happily accept death. He had resigned himself to his fate. There was no going back from this now, not after everything that had happened. Amoran had been plotting his escape for the past month, carefully watching and waiting for his chance to make a dash for freedom and escape from the backwater agricultural world where he had been condemned. Sentenced to spend the rest of his days as part of a work detail of the Forsaken that planted, grew, and harvested crops to feed the vast Lendai armies. He had taken note of the transport ship schedule that routinely landed on the planet. Not the big cargo haulers used to transport vast quantities of grain and crops off-world, but the smaller transports that ferried supplies to the various settlements dotting the world's surface. Once a week, just before dusk at the week's close, a transport would land in the clearing designated for the landing zone outside the small town, adjacent the vast fields the work teams tended. The sound of footsteps brought Amoran out of his musing as he turned his attention to whoever was approaching. Right on cue, a squad of 4 guards from the local garrison had arrived to get them up and march them to the mess hall for breakfast before they set out into the fields for the day's work. He said nothing as the guards shouted at them to rise and get into line as they marched out of their hut and began the trek to the main building that sat at the center of the camp. He strode along at the end of the line as his team merged with multiple others and assembled upon the oval at the camp center, right next to the mess hall where their meals were served. "If you can't sleep, would you mind going outside and not wandering around the hut?" one of his bunkmates, a squat Lendai named Kulo, asked. Your restlessness is making it difficult for the rest of us to sleep, he complained. Amoran sneered at him in response. Kulo knew as well as he did that the guards wouldn't tolerate him wandering around the camp after curfew. Forgive me, he said. Next time I won't bother our bunkmates by pacing around inside the hut, Amoran said with a nod. Kulo smiled in return. Good, thank you. I'll beat you to death instead, Amoran said with a smile. Kulo's expression changed to one of horrified shock as Amoran smiled at him malevolently. Like most of the Forsaken, Kulo was a coward, his spirit and will having been broken by the revelation that the gods had turned their backs on him. The inkling of the thought that he understood the sentiment nudged itself into Amoran's mind, but he quickly banished the notion, not wanting to emphasize with this pathetic weakling. Another of their work detail, a former biologist named Zom Ankor, shook his head. Leave Amoran be, Kulo. You know as well as the rest of us that he is having a hard time accepting his fate, he said, chastising the other Lendai. We all did to begin with, Zom added. He smiled softly at the former warrior. I know it's hard to accept, but it takes time. You'll come to find a new meaning to this wretched existence we call life soon enough. We all do. Amoran ignored Zom's patronizing assurances as the others began jabbering among themselves, discussing how they came to find a sense of meaning and purpose to their miserable, worthless lives. He rolled his eyes in disgust. If they had any self-respect at all, they would have done the honorable thing and ended their own lives. That way they might save themselves from damnation in the afterlife, and be consigned to the tranquility of the void, instead of the horrors that awaited in the depths of Naraka. They were ushered into the mess hall, along with the other work details, a group of 200 forsaken slaves stripped of their domains, identities, and places in Lendai society, all reduced to the level of slaves. Amoran ate in silence as the others talked and joked with each other, happy to be left alone with his thoughts. They had quickly learned to leave him be, after an overly friendly infidel named Chinky Banya had insisted on trying to befriend him, despite his aggressive responses and insistence to be let be. As a result, he had beat Banya to death and ripped his throat out with his bare hands. It earned him a savage beating from the camp guards, but it ensured the other Forsaken all gave him a wide berth. After the morning meal, they were all marched out into the fields to begin the day's work. Today was the day Amoran planned to make his escape. It had taken several months of careful planning and observation, but he was finally ready to make his bid for freedom. His work detail was paired with another, and assigned a plot they had harvested several months ago, one that was relatively close to the landing zone where the ship he intended to commander for his escape would soon be landing, to unload its cargo. The field was a paddy of juri berries, flavorful fruits that grew in hedge like vines that naturally grew in swamps. What had been a small lake had been cultivated into a paddy for the berries, with a lot of the water being diverted into a trench system, with multiple smaller paddies being cultivated for the growing of the berries. Teams of guards watched over the work crews as they moved among the paddies, plucking the berries from the hedges and collecting them into large sacks. Amoran worked in silence while the others talked around him, Kulo and another of his work team, Jaza, trying their best to work their charms on a female named Amila. Despite the fact she was an infidel, and one of those the gods had deemed unworthy of their blessing, Amoran had to admit that she was attractive. Unlike many of the Forsaken who inhabited their work camp, she hadn't been disfigured by modifications or implants that had been rejected or corrupted in some manner. Ami had been cast out of Lendai society because an ill omen had occurred at the time of her wedding, a portent of doom from the gods that signaled that she was beyond their graces. She was subsequently rejected by her friends and family and cast aside. She was doomed to spend the rest of her days here, on this agricultural world, for some failing that lay beyond her comprehension. For her part, Ami ignored their advances and continued plucking the berries from the vines and dumping them into her sack. I don't know how the gods could see fit to reject one as beautiful as yourself, Jaza said with a goofy smile. Surely they have lost their senses, or are blind to do so, he added. If I were Khan Zama, I would have made you my Lendai queen, my mortal wife, fit to be the mistress of the Creator, Jaza said. Ami sighed and rolled her eyes in exasperation. Amoran grit his teeth and fought back a response. Who was Jaza to question the will of the gods? If they had sent a sign to indicate that Ami-La was no longer worthy of their blessing, then they surely had good reason for it. The gods did not make mistakes. One of the guards came around the corner of a row of hedges and brandished his spear at them. "Shut up, Kafkas, get back to work. You're here to harvest fruit, not talk," he snarled at them. The two males left Ami alone and returned to their duties as the guards stood watch over the group. The warrior watching over them soon turned his own attention to Ami, albeit he was much more aggressive and direct in his approach than her other two suitors. While they had attempted to woo her with their admittedly somewhat lacking charms, the guard, Horak, didn't bother trying to win her approval. He was a warrior, in a position of power, and she, no more than a slave that had been shamed by the gods. If he wanted something from her, Horak intended to simply take it. "You're very beautiful. Did you know that?" Horak asked Ami, crouching next to her as she plucked berries from the hedge. "It makes me wonder why the gods would reject a beautiful woman such as yourself," he said. When she hesitated to pluck the next berry, he chuckled and grinned. "What did you do?" he asked. "You must have done something very bad for them to reject you." She refused to respond and kept plucking berries from the hedge, trying her best to ignore him. "Tell me," he insisted. "What did you do?" "I know," he said with a seedy grin when she failed to respond. "You did something very naughty, didn't you? I can tell you're the filthy type," Horak cooed. "You look like the glamorous, modest, and respectful sort, but I bet deep down you're a filthy, unrepentant whore." He chuckled at her obvious discomfort as he ran his hand down her thigh and stroked her cheek. Ami shuddered and tried to inch away from him. He smiled and licked his lips. Horak reached out and grasped her breast and began kneading the flesh beneath her robe. She whimpered uncomfortably and tried to wriggle away from him. He laughed in response and grabbed her by the back of the neck with his other hand as he continued molesting her. Amoran sneered at the scene before him and felt his anger rising at the way the perverted Horak was abusing Ami. Such conduct for a Lendai was dishonorable to say the least. He felt nothing but contempt for the other members of the work detail who simply stood by and watched, being too cowardly to say or do anything to intervene. He knew he would probably have to engage the guards in combat to make his escape, but he hadn't anticipated this turn of events, or the fact there would be witnesses. It was a complication to his plans, but he pushed it aside. He had learned long ago that nothing ever went according to plan, no matter how well planned, organized, or executed. Horak either sensed or saw him approach. He looked up at the former warrior just in time to see the bottom of his boot collide with his face, sending him sprawling into the hedge of juri berries. Horak fell into the brush with a splash, as branches and vines cracked and snapped under his weight, and left him flailing about in the knee-deep water. Before he could recover, Amoran was on him, pummeling his skull with his fist. Horak grabbed at his shunya, a long dagger with a serrated edge that was a crustacean creature, biologically engineered and bred for the purpose. He waved it about as he attempted to stab Amoran, but the warrior managed to avoid being skewered by his jabbing blade. He retaliated by grasping Horak by the head, driving his thumb into his left eye socket, gouging out his eye as the eyeball burst, and began oozing blood and black ichor that streamed down his face. Horak shrieked and dropped the knife as he tried to pry the warrior's hand away from his face. Seeing the weapon fall from the guard's grasp, Amoran snatched it up and twisted his grip on the blade as he brought it down into the struggling guard's face, driving it between his eyes with a powerful shove. Horak's body went limp as Amoran released him, and he fell back into the water with a splash. Amoran rose and turned to face the rest of the work crew who stood by, watching the brawl. He hadn't anticipated anything like this. It complicated his plans as he found himself facing 3 potential opponents who presented an obstacle to his escape. "You killed him," Jaza said. "They'll kill you slowly and painfully when they discover what you've done," Kulo added. "I don't plan on being here when they find his corpse," Amoran replied. "I've been planning to make my escape for some time." Ami's eyes widened in surprise. "Escape? Such a thing isn't possible. No one has ever escaped before." Amoran nodded. "I am aware. I have a plan to hijack one of the cargo ships that will be landing as we speak. I will use it to return to Yakshar to enact my revenge upon the Inquisitor, who caused my Sarah Claw to reject and stole my woman from me," he explained, motioning to the place where his arm had been amputated. "The gods did that to you, friend, not the Inquisitor," Jazza said. Amoran shook his head. No, he insisted. I know it was him. He confessed it to me after I was imprisoned and sentenced to be sent here. Kulo and Jazza stared at Amoran, as if they didn't quite know what to make of his story. It was an interesting one, to say the least. I know that because of his treachery I will be forever cursed in the eyes of our people, but I do not mean to redeem myself or clear my name, Amoran explained. My goal, my only goal now, is to enact my revenge upon Quanran Far, and prove myself to the gods that I am still worthy of their favor, even if it means my life is forfeit in the process. Ami gazed at him admiringly, while the other two continued to gape at him like fools, unsure what to think. In any case, thank you for coming to my aid and saving me from that Pitha slug, Ami said. You put your own life plans and freedom at risk for my sake. It is most brave and noble of you. She cast a glance at the other two members of their work detail. Unfortunately, the same can't be said of others, she added. Amoran shrugged the praise off. Your praise of me is misplaced. I planned to kill him regardless. What happened just accelerated my plans, but in less than desirable circumstances. Ami was slow to respond, staring at him as she drew an intake of breath and nodded in acceptance. Despite whatever Amoran said, he had still gone out of his way and complicated things for himself on her part. He had admitted that much himself, and for that she felt she owed him. Go, she said, meeting his gaze and holding it. Before more guards come and you lose your chance to escape, Ami said. We will cover for you to buy you enough time to get to the landing zone. I owe you that much at least. Amoran nodded his thanks, and began stripping the dead warrior of his armor. Fortunately, during their scuffle it hadn't been damaged. Wait a minute, what? Kulo started to protest before an icy glare from Ami shut him up. I said, I owe him that much, and if you two dungworms want to live through this day, you'll help me and do as I say. We're all complicating a guard's murder now, whether we like it or not, she snarled at them. You think the warden will believe you're innocent? Before they could respond, she began issuing orders and formulating a plan in her mind. Push that corpse down into the water, hide him under the hedges and secure him to the vines. That should keep his corpse hidden for a few hours at least, she commanded, as Amoran finished donning the armor, cuirass, greaves, boots, and gauntlet. Kulo and Jazza looked at each other, with Kulo offering up a shrug as he moved to do as instructed. Jazza let out a sigh and quickly followed him. Amoran studied her for a few moments and then bowed his head in gratitude. Many thanks to you. I wish you well in the future, Amila. Glory to the brave, he said, extending his hand as a sign of mutual respect. She took his hand and shook it firmly. Glory to the brave, she echoed, reciting the warrior's mantra. May the gods see to it that you have your revenge. He said nothing and nodded in acknowledgement, before turning and fleeing from the berry paddies, heading into the forest that lined the side of the swamp. With the majority of the planet being farms and forests, the guards didn't keep too tight a watch on the work detail. With no other settlements apart from Lendai encampments and no way to get off-world, there was nowhere to run. Any workers that fled were hunted down by hounds and captured within the next few days. The punishment for fleeing being public torture, flaying and burning alive to set an example for anyone who harbored foolish notions of freedom. Amoran made his way through the forest, heading through the trees towards the northern end of the woods, where they lined the edge of the landing zone. He crouched behind some shrubbery at the tree line and looked out at the clearing beyond. Sure enough, the transport he planned to commandeer was there, its cargo being offloaded onto a long, reptilian beast of burden with a dozen legs. A group of 4 workers ferried the goods off the ship, while 2 guards stood nearby, one watching them work and another keeping an eye out for any would-be interlopers. Although security was fairly lax due to the fear they instilled in the slaves, the local prefect still ensured that guards were stationed wherever needed, just in case the Forsaken ever decided to try and revolt, like they had done elsewhere numerous times in the past. The ship's crew was nowhere to be seen. They were either all inside the ship or had moved into the nearby compound. 2 of the workers unloading the ship were carrying a large, awkward, and heavy-looking chest off the ship when they stumbled and dropped it. The other 2 workers rushed over to help them upright it and get it onto the huge reptile. The guard supervising them began shouting and gesturing wildly, clearly irate that they had dropped the cargo. The other, distracted by the scene, had turned his back on Amoran as he watched them resume struggling with the chest. Seeing his opportunity, Amoran dashed from the forest and broke into a run, running across the field towards the cargo ship. He clutched the knife he'd taken from Horak in his good hand, ready to strike at the guards as he came within range of them. The guard facing away from him didn't know he was coming until the last second. Hearing his rapid footsteps, he turned just in time to see Amoran leap at him as he drove the blade into the guard's throat. The guard emitted a pained gurgle of surprise as blood gushed from the gaping wound in his throat. Amoran released his hold on the knife and drew the guard's sword from his belt as he fell to his knees, clutching at his neck in an attempt to stop the life from pouring out of him. The other guard noticed Amoran then, having been distracted by reprimanding the clumsy workers. He drew his sword and with a shout hurled himself at the oncoming warrior. The guard swung his blade in a sweeping overhead arch at Amoran, who nimbly leapt aside of the slash and countered with a thrust at his midsection. The guard blocked the blow and deftly shoved his opponent's blade aside with his own. Amoran countered by bringing his sword back around in a slash at his foe's neck, which was promptly blocked. Without a moment's pause, he brought his sword swinging back around for another attack, hacking at the guard's knees and midsection in turn, only to have both attacks blocked by his foe's blade. The guard lunged at him, thrusting his sword at Amoran's stomach. Amoran spun aside, twisting to his left and striking at the enemy's right leg, opening a long gash in his thigh that began to bleed profusely. As Amoran completed his dance around his foe, he raked his sword across his back, the blade slicing through the armor and scoring the flesh beneath. The guard howled in agony and swung around to face Amoran, slashing at him in a move intended to take his head off his shoulders. Amoran dropped onto his haunches as the sword sailed over his head, and in one swift motion plunged his blade into the other warrior's abdomen. He gave it an extra shove for good measure. The guard gurgled something unintelligible through mouthfuls of blood and collapsed, laying in a heap on the ground as Amoran stood. He could hear shouting and running feet as the workers who had fled the battle alerted the garrison, and warriors rushed in their droves to prevent his escape. Not wasting a moment, Amoran turned and fled into the ship. Silence met him as he made his way to the cockpit. As he had anticipated, the crew was elsewhere, leaving him alone and unobstructed to commandeer the vessel. He dived into the pilot's chair as his hand began racing over the controls, the deck resembling a buffet of coral, shellfish, and obscure plant life, as he raised the access ramp and shoved his hand into the warm, fleshy, membranous sockets that served as the steering and primary controls. The ship came to life with a whine that sounded far more animal than machine, as its systems began powering up, and it quite literally awoke. The ship lifted into the air as a horde of warriors bust out onto the landing zone, brandishing weapons and hurling projectiles, continuing its ascent into the sky as it left the planet's atmosphere and entered the vastness of space. Amoran withdrew his hand from the steering pod, hitting various buttons and switches on the control board as he punched in the coordinates for the Lendai homeworld. Flying the vessel with a single hand was difficult but not impossible. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, the stars suddenly burst to life in front of him and began flashing past the forward viewport at the speed of light as the ship entered the wormhole he had summoned and rocketed across the galaxy. With nothing to do but wait, Amoran began to search the ship for more weapons. It was unlikely any of the crew were armed, seeing as cargo ship crews mainly consisted of workers and as such were forbidden from carrying weapons. Fortunately, he found a bolt thrower on board, a triangular projectile weapon that fired a tough crustacean creature that burrowed into its target like a drill. Hours later, the alarm sounded to alert him that the ship would be exiting the wormhole and arriving at its destination, waking the warrior from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in months. Startling awake, Amoran prepared himself for landing. He hoped reports of the stolen ship hadn't yet made it to the Lendai capital, otherwise his landing was going to be a very chaotic one, as starfighters were undoubtedly dispatched to hunt him down. Fortunately, he was unopposed as the ship emerged from the wormhole, and he began guiding it down towards the planet's surface. As the ship closed in on the capital, he could see planetary traffic moving to and from the various settlements that dotted the world. He eased into a lane of incoming ships and cruised along with the flow of traffic. While the ship made its gradual descent, Amoran prepared himself for battle. He did a mental inventory of the weapons he had, and it wasn't very comforting. Apart from the armor, he had a sword and dagger he had obtained from the first guard he'd killed, and the bolt thrower he had found on board. He brought the ship down in a public docking bay, as close to the temple district as he could find, and disembarked. It was early in the morning, and few of the local populace were around at this hour, which allowed him to walk unchallenged and unmolested among the streets as he strode towards the massive temple complex. A few gave him a second glance. A warrior with an amputated limb drew some odd looks as to why he hadn't had an implant of some sort attached to the limb, but no one approached or addressed him. Amorin headed towards the citadel of Kanzama, the creator god, and king of all the deities of the Lendai. The Grand Inquisitor, although not a priest, had his residence in the temple, his role and caste being closely associated with that of the divine creator. As his personal assistant, Quanren Far also resided in his master's quarters. Amorin walked through terraced streets littered with gardens, streams, waterfalls, and ponds dedicated to the gods in the natural world, the Lendai having a deep reverence for nature. As he entered the temple district, he could see the gargantuan citadel of Kanzama looming off to his right, its many spires raking the heavens. The warrior began ascending the expansive staircase that led to the entrance of the mighty temple, its huge doors gaping open like the cavernous maw of a gigantic beast. 4 warriors stood at their posts, in pairs on either side of the entranceway. No one could simply enter the citadel, except without permission or during sacred occasions. Hence he knew that from this point on, he would be fighting for his life. Amorin made his way up the steps, keeping his good hand close to his side where the bolt thrower rested, just inches away. He avoided eye contact with the guards as he approached, not wanting them to suspect anything was amiss while he had the element of surprise. As he got closer, he looked one in the eye, as the guard stepped forwards to meet him. The guard said something to him that he ignored as his hand came up grasping the bolt thrower. The guard's eyes widened in surprise, and he only had time to shout in alarm before a bolt from the weapon pierced his throat, tearing it to shreds. The warrior fell to the ground, drowning in a pool of his own blood as Amorin opened fire on the others. The next 2 bolts took another in the torso, gouts of blood erupting from within the armor, as it was shattered by the furiously burrowing crustaceans who tore through the meat beyond, making mince of the flesh around them. One of the warriors began shouting into the communicator on his wrist, but his message was cut short by a bolt hitting him right between the eyes as his face was mulched. The final warrior drew his sword and hurled himself at their attacker, the speed and ferocity of his attack taking Amorin off guard, distracted while he had been dealing with the other warriors. The guard came charging at him with the sword raised high above his head. Amorin fell into a crouch as he approached, emptying the last 2 bolts into the warrior's midsection. The warrior groaned in agony and keeled over, falling flat onto his face at the top of the stairs. Amorin passed the corpses of the dead warriors and entered the shadowy confines of the cavernous temple. The Grand Inquisitor and his initiates began their day early. He judged that they would be beginning the day's work, assembling in the antechamber that served as the Grand Inquisitor's office and laboratory. He dropped the bolt thrower and began marching up the stairs, drawing his sword as he readied himself to face more of the temple's defenders. He heard shouts of alarm and running feet as he climbed the winding stairway. Up ahead of him, a group of 3 guards armed with spears hustled out of an adjoining doorway. Without a moment's hesitation, the 3 of them saw him and charged. Amorin deftly leapt aside of the warrior leading the charge, shoved the point of another spear away from him with his sword, and threw himself at the other. A spear tip plunged itself into Amorin's side, drawing a pained roar from the warrior. He lashed out with his sword, targeting the weapon itself and sheaving it in 2 with a powerful downward slice. The warrior's eyes widened in shock as Amorin dropped his sword, heaved the other end from his side and flipped it around in his grip before hurling it back at his assailant, the spear tip plowing through the armor and sinking its teeth into his sternum. The guard fell to the ground, groaning in pain as Amorin retrieved his sword and turned his attention back to the other 2. The first thrust the tip of his spear at him, again and again. Amorin, hindered by the fact he had only 1 good arm, batted the weapon away. Before locking his blade with the spear and giving it a violent shove away from him, stepped inside the warrior's guard and swung his sword up and around in one swift movement that severed the guard's head from his shoulders. The final guard charged at him with a battle cry, lowering his spear in front of him like a battering ram. Amoran, ignoring the flashing pain in his side, leapt aside of the weapon and deflected it with his sword, before reversing the sword's trajectory and driving it into the guard's stomach as they passed each other. The guard screamed in agony as he withdrew the blade and kicked the dying and staggering warrior to the ground. Pushing aside the burning pain in his side, Amoran sheathed his sword and retrieved one of the spears, holding it at the ready as he resumed his trek towards the upper levels of the citadel. He was nearing the Grand Inquisitor's chambers when a group of half a dozen warriors scrambled down the stairs ahead of him and onto the landing on the next level. As soon as they caught sight of him, the warriors bellowed a war cry as one and charged. Amoran's heart skipped a beat at the sheer number of opponents, but he grit his teeth and met their war cries with a roar of his own and leapt into the fray. He skewered the first on the end of the spear and shoved him into the warrior behind him as he released his hold on the weapon and drew his sword. Amoran ducked under a horizontal swipe at his head and thrust his sword into the stomach of his attacker, withdrawing it just in time to block a strike at his shoulder as he locked swords with another warrior. He sent the warrior sprawling with a kick to his gut. He leapt aside of another blow that was aimed at splitting him in two as the blade whooshed down, barely missing his ear. Amoran leapt to his feet and slashed his blade up the warrior's middle, opening a deep gash in the armor that saved the soldier's life. The warrior swung at him once more. He blocked the blow as they traded a flurry of strikes that ended when Amoran dragged his sword across his enemy's stomach, opening him up from hip to hip and dumping the warrior's guts all over the floor. A warrior on his right came at him with an axe, which he blocked with his sword, but wasn't fast enough to stop another from his left, opening a long gash in his thigh which began spewing blood. Roaring in pain and fury, Amoran stepped towards the axe-wielder and hooked his amputated arm around the weapon, where it had been severed at the elbow, pulling it in close to him before he severed both the warrior's arms at the forearm, with a downward slash. Blood pumped from the severed limbs as the warrior screamed in agony, his cries being cut short as Amoran's blade raked itself across his throat. The two remaining warriors rushed him at once, working in tandem to bring the rampaging warrior down. Amoran blocked a swipe at his knees and ducked under a slash at his face, before dodging a thrust at his sternum and blocking another at his right hip. Back and forth the three combatants fought, Amoran outnumbered, and with only one good arm, struggling to keep the two of them at bay as precious seconds passed and reinforcements drew nearer. The two of them kept him occupied with their combined attacks, barely giving him an opportunity to retaliate and forcing him to fight defensively. The wounds in his thigh and right side burned intensely as the pain threatened to distract him. On top of facing two determined foes, he was also injured and tiring, as both wounds continued to bleed. With an animalistic snarl, Amoran blocked a strike at his shoulder from his left and shoved the warrior's blade aside as he turned his attention to the warrior on his right, leaping at him with everything he had. The warrior struggled to deflect the oncoming barrage of blows, the savagery of Amoran's attacks taking him by surprise. His defenses faltered and fell as Amoran raked a long diagonal gash down his cuirass, then flipped his sword's trajectory, bringing it back around and thrusting the blade into the warrior's chest. Before Amoran could act to defend himself, the other warrior was upon him, driving his own blade into Amoran's left side as agonizing waves of pain shot through him, making Amoran see stars as he withdrew his sword from his victim and swung blindly at his attacker. The other warrior casually blocked his attack and swung his sword at him again. Amoran deflected the attack, and the two of them fought back and forth, exchanging blows and parries for a short time, until Amoran swung with a feint at his opponent's right shoulder, before pulling his sword back too soon and drawing it back in upon himself and reversing its trajectory in a thrust at the warrior's middle. The warrior tried to bring his blade around to deflect the blow, but wasn't fast enough. The blade plunged into his stomach, and he let out a groan of pain as the life flowed out of him, falling to the floor as Amoran withdrew the blade. Amoran strode past the corpses of the dead warriors and up the final flight of steps, entering the chambers of the Grand Inquisitor with a bloody sword in his hand. A feral grin crossed Amoran's lips as he saw the look of shock and horror on the face of Quanren Far at seeing him standing here before his master in this sacred place, when he was sure he had disposed of the warrior forever. "Amoran Kai," Far gasped. No, it cannot be. Yes, oh, but it is, Amorin hissed in response. You took everything from me, Quanran Far, he snarled, and I have come to take my vengeance. What is this? Demanded the Grand Inquisitor. Your Excellency, this vile worm conspired to steal my woman from me, Amorin said. He sabotaged the Sarok claw implant I had by poisoning the Sarok, causing my body to reject it, making it appear that the gods had abandoned me, causing me to be labeled one of the Forsaken and disgracing my name. He explained. Quanran Far scoffed. Nonsense, your implant rejected because the gods decided you were no longer worthy to be within their divine graces. He chided Amorin. Do not blame me for your failures. Amorin snarled in response, baring his teeth at the Inquisitor. Your treachery will not go unpunished. Although I am mortally wounded, I shall see you dead before I... With that he raised his sword and charged the terrified Inquisitor, who screamed in terror and tried to flee. He didn't get far before Amorin caught up with him, hacking at him with the sword and tearing his back open in a long diagonal slash. Quanran Far howled with pain, his cries being cut short as Amorin flipped the sword around and drove it through his back, the blade protruding out his stomach, skewering him upon it. Amorin withdrew the blade with a wet sucking sound, as the Inquisitor fell to the ground, his eyes wide with shock and terror. Quanran Far whimpered as he lay on the ground, the life flowing out of him as a pool of crimson gore formed around him, and his breathing became slow and heavy. The Grand Inquisitor stood watching the scene before him, not quite sure what to make of it, but intensely interested regardless. Tell me, Amorin Kai, he rasped. How do you know Quanran Far poisoned you? He asked, unmoved by the sight of his subordinate, dying in a pool of his own blood. Amorin tittered on his feet, but regained his composure and bowed to the Grand Inquisitor. He felt increasingly weak from the loss of blood. He confessed it to me, Your Excellency, he said. When I was imprisoned in the dungeon before being deported to an agricultural world, he came to visit and confess. I suspect with the intent of boasting about his crimes and wanting me to know it was he who caused my downfall, Amorin explained, falling to one knee as his head swam and it became difficult to concentrate. His breathing became labored, as his heart rate decreased, and he felt the life leaving him as he succumbed to his wounds. And how did he do this? The Grand Inquisitor inquired. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, he said, clasping his hands in front of himself. Amorin nodded. He claimed he used the venom of a Zakuiwek, he said. The creature's venom poisoned my implanted limb and slowly killed it, causing an infection to spread throughout my body as the limb was rejected and died. The Grand Inquisitor nodded in acceptance of this explanation. That is correct. Zakuiwek venom would do that. And a mere warrior would not know this detail of the alchemy of our work, he replied, stroking his chin with a clawed finger. More investigation is required, of course, but if your story is correct, the infection caused by the venom will be present in your blood. If tests yield a positive result, your story will be true, and you will be vindicated in the eyes of the gods. Amorin hung his head in a sign of humility. My thanks to you, Your Excellency, he said. It was my only desire to revenge myself. But if I can clear my name, so it shall be known that the gods did not forsake me, and that my memory shall not be stained, then I gladly welcome that. The Grand Inquisitor nodded. If your story is true, then I assure you the truth will be known, and you will be honored as a brave and loyal warrior, to the last. Amorin raised his head and smiled. Glory to the brave, he declared. Glory to the brave, the Grand Inquisitor echoed. With tremendous effort, Amorin rose to his feet, saluted the Grand Inquisitor, roared glory to the brave with every ounce of his strength, then died, falling to the ground in a heap. The Grand Inquisitor surveyed the scene in silence for a few moments before he let out a sigh with a shake of his head. It's a pity to lose two good servants in one day,